welcome to all of the members. This is meeting number 6 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on June 16, 2025, the committee is resuming its study of Canada's engagement in a rules-based international trade and investment system. We have with us today from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Stuart True, Senior Researcher, and from the Chamber of Shipping, Bonnie G., President by video conference, and the Grain Growers of Canada, Kyle Larkin, Executive Director. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for finding the time to come and speak to the committee today. We will start with 5 minutes for each one. Mr. True, if you would like to start, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Sure. Pleasure to do so. Thanks very much for the invitation to appear before this committee. I am a researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. We've been around since 1980, pursuing, social, economic, and environmental justice, pushing policies that would push us in those directions. And I direct the Trade and Investment Research Project there, which was established in 1999, right around the time of the battle in Seattle, to push back against some of these rules that we're talking about today in these global trade rules. So I'm going to make a few broad points, I think, that I hope have relevance to both the committee studies right now, one with respect to the CUSMA review and one with respect to the rules-based international order. We're obviously very preoccupied, as I know everyone around this committee is, with the trade wars we're seeing right now from the United States and the deindustrialization that we're seeing in this country, very much on purpose, right? A part of what Trump is trying to do to this country. So very concerned about that. With respect to these rules, the rules-based order, I'll just make a few points. So one, the order established by the WTO and the web of trade agreements that we've had in place since the early 1990s. They've pretty much been contested from the beginning. I don't think it was ever settled. It never congealed. It's been a site of contestation from the beginning, for good reason. Whether in the streets, in public protests, in Hong Kong, Sao Paulo, Cancun, or else in academic discourse and in government policy rooms. The belief that these rules reflected a universal truth, I think, about the limits of governing in a free market economy, I think that was hubristic from the beginning, and we're starting to see the effects of that, and we're starting to see people realizing that at this point. We took a relatively flexible system for regulating global commerce in the GATT, a system that acknowledged, for example, how imbalances in production may become an economic and political problem, a burden for countries, and that allowed states to negotiate temporary safeguards like import quotas or tariffs. And we built a rigid set of overlapping treaties that lock countries into policies that, if followed strictly, pretty much stunted industrial development and enshrined corporate rights to the detriment of other international priorities and rights, like creating good jobs, preserving high environmental and public health standards, and high wages, upholding human rights, indigenous peoples' rights, and so on and so forth. All these other international obligations took a back seat to never-ending growth and the fantasy of perfect market competition within and between nations. The system was built to fail, and we should not mourn its passing. We do obviously, I think, need rules to avoid beggar-thy-neighbor policies that help domestic jobs and help domestic investors by harming other people's jobs and other people's investments. I mean, that I would say that's the MAGA model, the Trump model. There's something the government can do, though, here through reforms to our own trade remedies policy, as other witnesses, I think, have pointed out to this committee recently. Unifor, another example, Unifor, Canada's largest private sector union, has called on Canada to deploy other measures like the Foreign Extraterritorial Measures Act to penalize companies that use the excuse of tariffs to move their capital into the United States, as we're seeing in companies like Diageo and Futura Tool and Die right now. At the same time, Canada should play its part in the world as a fair dealer. We shouldn't just go around breaking rules willy-nilly. We should abide by commitments we've made related to tariffs and market access. But in other areas like procurement or excessive intellectual property rights or excessive limits on how we regulate or set industrial strategy, we need to be prepared to bend and I think in some cases break some of these more unreasonable rules, as other countries are doing, let's be honest. Which is my second point, which is preserving the old rules of free trade is contradictory to Canada's efforts to forge transformative industrial strategy. Buy Canadian policies, in particular on large construction and infrastructure projects, are a no-brainer, with minimal, if any, impact on trading relations. Everybody else is doing it. European nations don't lose sleep, right, when they give contracts to European companies. And I don't think we should either. I think they'll understand if we start to do this in a more systematic way. We've also seen the European Union now following Canada and Mexico and putting steel tariffs in place, right, to protect their own industries. So there is some shifting, right, of these strict rules. None of this is WTO compliant, just as Canada's retaliatory tariffs on Trump in the early days, which I think were a good idea, were not WTO compliant, but they were necessary to protect Canadian jobs. They were necessary to protect our economic security, to use Trump's language. The third final point I'll make is that rules-based trade should help workers as well as companies. We have successes to build on, like the rapid response labor mechanism in the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. This is producing results for workers in Mexico, but it needs to be shielded and expanded to cover Canadian and US workplaces as well, so that we can start to discuss and extend the system in other countries. We can't do that unless we're also committing to these same rules that we're applying in Mexico. In light of the new Canada-Mexico Action Plan, I think it would be beneficial to strengthen cooperation with Mexico in areas like human rights as well, by supporting the protection mechanism for human rights defenders and journalists, which is under the jurisdiction of the Mexican government. This benefits Canadian businesses by giving them greater assurances that their Mexican operations are not going to be involved, perhaps involuntarily, in human rights violations. And finally, I would say Canada needs to withdraw from the investor-state dispute settlement regime, which neither promotes nor truly protects investment in other countries or in Canada. International investment arbitration is the opposite of rules-based trade in many respects. Its practitioners are constantly expanding the rules that on their own in arbitration. They're constantly expanding corporate protections beyond the wishes of negotiating parties, with no demonstrable benefit in terms of added investment or especially added sustainable investment. It's anti-democratic. It undermines legal reforms in those countries that would better provide security and would better provide business stability. So those are my comments for now, and I appreciate this opportunity again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. True. On to Mr. Larkin, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee for inviting us. My name is Kyle Larkin, and I am the Executive Director of Grain Growers of Canada, also known as GGC. We are the national voice for over 70,000 producers through our 14 national, provincial, and regional grower groups. As the farmer-driven association for the grain sector, GGC champions federal policies that support the competitiveness and profitability of grain growers across Canada. With over 70% of the grain grown in Canada exported, rules-based trade is critical to the livelihoods of family-run grain farms across the country. In fact, we export our grain and grain products to over 160 countries around the world, creating $45 billion in export value annually. Unfortunately, though, the rules-based trading order and Canadian exports are being challenged today like never before. Trade uncertainty, tariffs, and non-tariff barriers are on the rise, directly impacting grain producers across the country who rely on international trade for their individual farm revenues. Most concerning is the trade uncertainty that we are currently experiencing with our two largest trading partners. The United States, which accounted for over $17 billion of grain and grain product exports in 2023, has become an unreliable trading partner with changes in their international trade policy on an almost daily basis. Fortunately, all grain and grain product exports continue to be tariff-free under the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement. However, tariffs on steel and aluminum will have an impact on farm equipment pricing, and overall trade uncertainty has depressed markets for crops that family farms rely on. Our second largest trading partner, China, who accounted for over $9 billion of grain and grain product exports in 2023, has directly targeted grain farmers in the current trade spat between our two countries. 100% duties introduced earlier this year on canola oil, canola meal, and peas, and recently introduced 75.8% duties on canola seed have had a detrimental impact on farm gate revenues. China has also begun a new anti-dumping investigation into pea starch, furthering the effect on producers across the country. What can Canada do in this changing international trade landscape? We must first champion the rules-based trading order at home through our own domestic policies and decisions. As Michael Harvey from the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance mentioned to this committee about 2 weeks ago, protectionist measures, both domestically and internationally, should be rejected as they undermine the benefits that are created through free, fair, and open trade." End quote. Second, with over $45 billion in grain and grain product exports to over 160 countries around the world, Canada continues to be an important supplier of food. However, we have taken this position for granted for too long, with global competitors quickly catching up and competing for market shares. To ensure Canada remains one of the top agriculture and agri-food exporters in the world, we must champion the rules-based trading order globally, strengthen our market access engagement, and invest in trade-enabling infrastructure to meet the demands of the 21st century. Lastly, and most importantly, Canada must reset its key trading relationships. Trade uncertainty with our two largest trading partners is having a devastating impact on the livelihoods of family-run grain farms across Canada. The benefits of CUSMA to Canada, the United States, and Mexico need to be continuously promoted and defended. Ongoing and increased engagement with China is critical in resolving trade irritants. Canada must continue to instill, promote, and defend the rules-based trading order both domestically and internationally. Without it, our exports will shrink, impacting both grain farmers and Canada's national economy. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Larkin. On to Ms. Gee, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and honorable members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to present our perspectives on rules-based international trade and investment systems. The Chamber of Shipping is proud to represent international ship owners and operators that move more than $100 billion worth of goods through Canadian ports to and from over 150 overseas markets each year. From grain grown in the prairies to minerals mined in the north and tech products built in Ontario and BC, shipping connects Canadian producers to global markets. Canada depends on a rules-based international framework to ensure that ship operators comply with international standards established through the United Nations International Maritime Organization, or IMO, where Canada is viewed as a respected and influential maritime nation. The IMO negotiates conventions that set global standards for safety at sea, environmental protection, and maritime security. Flag states where ships are registered enforce IMO regulations through inspections of ships conducted by a global network of surveyors and port state control officers designated in countries where ships are operating. Canada is a signatory to the Paris Memorandum of Understanding on Port State Control, which consists of 28 participating maritime administrations that cover the waters of European coastal states and the North Atlantic Basin from North America to Europe. Canada is also a signatory to the Tokyo MOU, which consists of 22 member authorities in the Asia-Pacific region. The intention behind these MOUs is to eliminate the operation of substandard ships through concentrated inspection campaigns and a harmonized system. Canada's implementation of international conventions and guidelines are generally consistent with global standards. But when legislation or regulations deviate from these standards, there's often an increased cost for shipping lines doing business in Canada, which may impact the competitiveness of Canadian businesses. The international conventions and standards are meant to provide ship owners certainty in their investments in new builds and their contractual arrangements. Commercial shipping transactions are also executed under internationally recognized standard form agreements developed by the Baltic and International Maritime Council. These contracts are designed to streamline maritime operations, reduce legal risk, and ensure fairness and clarity to the parties involved. In the absence of international frameworks for shipping, there would be a plethora of conflicting national regulations, resulting in commercial distortion and administrative confusion for the industry, causing uncertainty, inconsistency, and inefficiency for global trade. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative's decision to impose new port entry fees on Chinese-built, owned, or operated vessels under a Section 301 trade action will take effect on October 14th. This will have an impact on vessels serving the North American trade and will likely result in increased freight rates and increased costs to U.S. businesses and consumers. Two container lines that trade regularly into the U.S. and Canadian ports could face up to $2.1 billion in additional costs in 2026. If Canada were to take a similar approach on Chinese-linked vessels, the harm to Canadian business could be greater. Furthermore, the United States' recent decision to not support the International Maritime Organization's Net Zero Framework, which is expected to be ratified in the coming weeks, carries significant implications. The Net Zero Framework sets annual GHG intensity reduction targets for ships' fuels through 2035, and penalties for exceeding GHG limits will apply. As Canada intends to ratify the Net Zero Framework, the U.S. to impose retaliatory tariffs on countries endorsing this framework is deeply concerning, as it may disrupt international trade flows and create further uncertainty for carriers operating in U.S. markets. This stance also risks undermining the competitiveness of Canadian businesses that rely on integrated supply chains and stable maritime governance. The global shipping industry has exhibited a high degree of operational agility in response to recent trade policy shifts and geopolitical disruptions. In the face of new regulatory measures and security threats to strategic maritime corridors, Shipping operators have rapidly adjusted routing strategies, reallocated fleet assets, and diversified port engagements to mitigate risk and maintain supply chain continuity. These adaptive responses are supported by advanced logistics technologies, integrated intermodal infrastructure, and robust contingency planning frameworks. The industry's capacity to respond swiftly and effectively to external shocks underscores its strategic importance in global trade and its resilience in navigating increasingly complex and volatile international environments. Canada's prosperity has long depended on the stability, transparency, and predictability, and openness afforded by the rules-based global trading system. However, this is a pivotal moment, and Canada should prioritize economic sectors that face the most severe shocks, while refining trade policies in a measured, decisive, and transparent manner to secure our own strategic economic interests and to ensure our sovereignty, prosperity, and resilience. The shipping industry is highly adaptive and will continue to respond effectively to regulatory and market changes driven by inherently competitive and dynamic nature. We are prepared to support Canada and its trade diversification strategy. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. We'll go on to the members. Mr. McKenzie, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to our three individuals coming before the committee today, bringing your background, your information, and much intelligent comment that we need to take into consideration. Mr. Larkin, if I could ask you first of all to give us a bit of detail. You mentioned prioritizing trade-enabling infrastructure. It strikes me as something that perhaps not entirely, but largely is going to be within our control in our country when so many things these days are not. Can you give us some further detail about that?
Great question. Thank you very much for that. Look, only just a few weeks ago, the Government of Canada came out with their major projects list, listed about 10 to 12 different projects on it. The Port of Montreal and the Port of Churchill made the list. But Canada's largest port, not only just for grain and grain products, but for Canada's economy at large, is the Port of Vancouver. And the Port of Vancouver, simply put, wasn't included on that list. I don't know why. We have over $35 million of grain and grain products that go through there every day. Over 50% of the grain grown in Canada goes through the Port of Vancouver. It's critically important for the sector. We rely on infrastructure there that was built in the early 1900s or the mid-1900s. I can tell you that countries around the world are investing billions of dollars in their trade-enabling infrastructure. The Port of Vancouver should be top of that list.
Absolutely. I think you may have made some comments previously on the Second Narrows Bridge. I presume that ties into that same capacity in the Port of Vancouver?
Second Narrows Rail Bridge is top of our list when it comes to the Port of Vancouver. It's a bridge that was built in the 60s. It needs to go up and down every time a ship passes underneath it. And because of the Trans Mountain Pipeline extension and its terminal, which is at the end of the bay, that bridge is going up and down like never before. And it's the only connection point between the South Shore and the North Shore of the Port of Vancouver. So if that bridge built in the 1960s were to ever fail, we would be in a pretty critical situation where at least half of the operations at the port would be inoperable for weeks, if not months.
So that seems like a perfectly boxed and gift-wrapped nation-building project for our government to consider.
100%.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think you've spoken as well about regulatory burdens that impact, I don't know if that's more in the shipping itself or in the production side, but can you comment on some of the things, again, things that we can do something about, notwithstanding what may be happening with our trading partners around the world?
Yeah, I mean, on the regulatory side of things, regulatory cooperation with the United States would be top of the list when I think of regulatory challenges that we have. Being able to integrate our regulatory systems with the U.S., but also with Mexico, especially on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, is extremely important. When we look at the CUSMA review or possible renegotiation, that would be near top of the list to make sure that we continue to work on that regulatory cooperation. So happy to see the government has taken that online a little bit more, but there needs to be a lot more work done there with both countries.
One of the things that has been identified in the holistic relationship between Canada and the U.S., of course, it contains much trade. Some of that is very technical. But trade irritants are things that our American partners have identified as problematic. Are there irritants in the shipping world that you can tell us about that we could put some address to?
That's a good question. I wouldn't say there's necessarily irritants in the grain and grain product space. I'm happy to say that grain farmers, be they in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Oklahoma, or Nebraska, all are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to grow crops. They're trying to make a livelihood. They're mostly run by mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. And what they're looking for is an equal partner in government, be it the American government or the Canadian government. And what they're looking for is trade to continue between our two countries. I always tell the story that oats grown in Manitoba are primarily shipped down the 5 or 6 states in the U.S., produced into Cheerios, and then those Cheerios are shipped back up here to Canada for families to enjoy across the country. And that's really the integrated nature of our agriculture space. And that story is told not just in the grain space, but it's told in the pork space, the cattle space. You know, you name the agriculture product, that's usually how it works.
We have a lot of public conversation these days about auto parts going back and forth across our border as a vehicle is assembled. But it is the same in agri-food and finished agricultural products produced for Canadians.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can look at the canola space as well. We ship a significant amount of canola down to the U.S. A lot of it goes to California, gets produced into biofuel, and some of that gets shipped back up here to Canada for individual Canadians or farmers to use in their equipment.
Mr. Larkin, I grew up in Saskatchewan, and my parents both grew up on the family farm in Manitoba, so I understand greatly what you're talking about. When we look beyond our borders, what markets would be priorities for grain farmers and exporters in Canada?
Well, I go back to the Port of Vancouver. The reason the Port of Vancouver is our most important port and the reason it's growing year to year is because the Indo-Pacific region is the fastest growing region in the world. That's not just me saying that. That's every country around the world knowing that to be a fact. So when we think of where are our next customers, we're looking at the Indo-Pacific 100%. We look at India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines. Almost every country in the Indo-Pacific is of critical importance for us. So we're keeping a close eye on the ASEAN negotiations. Hopefully those get done as soon as possible. The Indonesia-Canada Free Trade Agreement was a good boost to our trade there. One of the fastest growing markets in the region. So Indo-Pacific is top of the list.
And I would presume you're looking for a normalization of relations with India and increased trade there as well.
Absolutely.
Supplying food to that nation.
Yeah, I mean, India is critical for a lot of grain products, but especially important for pulses, peas, lentils, etc. India is one of the largest markets for pulses. There are challenges here and there on tariff or non-tariff barriers that come up every now and then. There's obviously a political challenge there that sometimes comes up based on how the political dynamics are between Canada and India. Our hope there is the same with China and the U.S. That relationship needs to be reset so we can get our trade back online.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. McKenzie. Ms. Lapointe, please.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Bonjour et bienvenue aux témoins.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to the witnesses. I have questions for you, Mr. Larkin, mainly concerning grains. You really piqued my curiosity with the question of the Cheerios crossing the border and coming back as a finished product. What is the percentage of grains that we produce here in Canada that are processed there and brought back to Canada?
How much products come back into Canada from the U.S., but I can tell you that over $17 billion of grain and grain products go to the U.S. Some of that is used for their own domestic market, but a lot of that gets manufactured into something else that then gets exported back up here into Canada.
Okay. Vous croyez pas qu'on pourrait les transformer ici, ceux qu'on...
Don't you think we could process what we want to consume up here?
Labor forces. I mean, there's obviously a lot of technicalities that are at play there. The U.S., because of its size, has a much larger grain and grain product market than we do. They obviously produce more grain than we do. So they have a bit of domestic market forces that allow some of their value-added processing to take place. But there's always an opportunity for that to grow in Canada, and it is growing. When you look around the Greater Toronto area, for example, there are growing plants of mills and bakeries that consume a lot of our wheat products from across the country, most of which is coming from the prairies. You look in the prairies, you have many success stories of value-adding products, pulses, creating pea starch, pea protein. Canola is probably the biggest success story of the amount of canola crushing we've been able to develop across the prairies over the past few years. Now we're opening up biofuel refineries in Canada so that we can really create a circular economy here where we grow the canola, we crush the canola, we produce it into biofuel, and then that biofuel is used by a farmer or by a Canadian. It's a slow-growing success story.
Okay. Intéressant parce que quand vous parlez des produits avec une valeur...
It's interesting because when you talk about value-added products, are there certain things that have changed since January because people were kind of stricken by the tariffs that the President of the United States announced on products. And when people started to take a look at what they were buying and where it came from, whether it's produced in Canada, has that had an impact?
Chains between Canada and the U.S. You know, at the end of the day, most, if not all, grain products that Canadians buy at the grocery store are made with Canadian grain. If you go to the grocery store right now and buy a box of cereal or even just a bag of flour, that flour is going to have to, it will have been produced from Canadian wheat. So we have a success story already of using our grain products, within Canada. But the other success story is we produce more than we need here in Canada, and that's why we export $45 billion worth internationally.
Merci. Vous avez piqué aussi ma curiosité. Tantôt, vous disiez que les... Bon.
Thank you. You also piqued my curiosity with what you said. Of course, the products, what we export to the U.S. are not tariff, but you said that you were going to be affected by equipment mainly because of steel. And how can that affect you, and to what degree?
Aluminum tariffs, how they could impact farmers on the equipment side of things. At the end of the day, the most popular brand in Canada and the U.S. for equipment, combines, tractors, etc., those who have been on the prairies, you would see in the green equipment, is John Deere. And John Deere is primarily manufactured in the U.S., and they use a lot of American steel and aluminum, but they also use a lot of Canadian steel and aluminum. So because of the tariffs back and forth between our two countries, we're already seeing an increase in pricing on that equipment for American consumers, and we're likely going to see it for Canadian farmers as well in the foreseeable future, only because of the tariffs that are between our two countries.
OK. Mais c'est juste sur les équipements, puis c'est des équipements que vous devez pas...
Fine, but it's just on the equipment, and you have a certain lifetime for that equipment. It's not every year.
Some farmers change their equipment every 4 years. Some farmers change their equipment every 20 years. But at the end of the day, we're likely to see a price increase on equipment, and equipment that already costs in the millions of dollars. You'd be lucky to find a combine or tractor that's under $1 million that's brand new. So when you're purchasing equipment, a lot of which is manufactured in the U.S., and it's not just on John Deere, it's Case, it's other equipment companies as well. We're likely to see a price increase at a time when farmers are seeing a decrease in the prices they're getting for their crops. So they're very much in a tight margin situation where I'm seeing a lot of farmers, grain farmers, that are actually losing out on revenue this year.
Merci beaucoup. J'apprécie. J'aurais une question pour Madame...
Thank you. I appreciate it. I have a question for Ms. G, is it? I can't see her.
Parlé tantôt de la...
You talked earlier about diversification of our free trade agreements. We have a number of free trade agreements. Which ones do you think are the most promising in the shipping industry?
Well, we operate in global markets, so we rely on free trade agreements around the world. Certainly, the Cosmo one has less of an impact for international carriers, as they tend to use railways to deliver those goods. But certainly, there's agreements with the Asian nations, ASEAN, which would be very important for us.
Madame de Belfait.
Thank you very much. Mr. Belfait, s'il vous plaît.
Présidence. Merci beaucoup aux invités.
Thank you very much to the guests. Mr. True, it's great to hear from you. This is not something we're accustomed to hearing. You are presenting a different vision of international trade, and you talk to us regularly about stricter measures being adopted to ensure reasonable diligence for businesses. And today, in your opening comments, you raised the fact that you would like the business ombudsman to have greater powers in order to intervene with businesses that need to be supervised more, or there are rogue businesses. Can you explain more the powers that the business ombudsman should have? Thank you for the question.
Specialist in the core. I do know that the position is empty now. We need to fill that position, right? We currently don't have an ombudsman looking into the activities of Canadian companies abroad. That's something that a number of organizations have been pushing for a while, is to strengthen that, to give their more investigative powers, the ability to force testimony from companies and so on and so forth. It's been quite a voluntary process so far. And that is very much part of the rules-based trading order that I think would actually improve things, not just for people, but for companies themselves, provide some kind of certainty. So first and foremost, we need to get that position filled. And then we need to start talking about, as has come up, I believe, at this committee a couple times, we need to start talking about giving that core more responsibilities, right? More investigative powers, more ability to bring companies to hold them accountable, right, for their actions abroad.
C'est ça, j'imagine que c'est urgent. On sait que le poste n'est pas
I imagine it's urgent if the position isn't filled. In addition to not having substantial powers, there's no concern to quickly replace that ombudsman. I talked to you about shipments intercepted between January 1, 2024 and June 25, 2025. Out of 34 shipments intercepted in Canada on account of suspicion of forced labor being used, only one was revealed to have forced labor coming from the region of Xinjiang, whereas in the same period, a number of different areas, there were shipments that were intercepted for those reasons in the United States. And there are measures in place right now to prevent products resulting from forced labor to appear in our supply chains. And what we're thinking is that it's not very effective. According to you, are Canadian controls sufficient to prevent products coming in that are manufactured through forced labor?
Evidently not.
Thank you for the question.
Problem. We don't have the resources the United States have to intercept and investigate these issues of forced labor in supply chains. It's certainly going to come up, right, in the CUSMA review at some point. The United States will be pushing Canada and Mexico to probably do more to stop imports from regions, especially in China, but also perhaps other regions. So we will be asked upon to pick up more of the slack. And so it is an important question about how we do that. I think we could have more transparent information, maybe more shared databases with the United States in terms of importers, giving that information to people outside of government, perhaps, outside the business sector, which could help in the investigations and bring cases forward. I was mentioning in my presentation the rapid response labor mechanism in Mexico, and this is how that operates. How it's been so successful is it's based on investigations that are started by workers themselves in the factories, and then followed through the institutions established through the Canada-U.S.-Mexico Agreement. So I can envision that as quite a positive thing for workers and human rights, right, in terms of the CUSMA review.
Est-ce que vous pensez qu'on pourrait plus...
Do you think that we might be able to do so through legislative means and create an act that would force businesses to prove rather that they're not using forced labor in order to produce their goods? Shouldn't Canada adopt the approach of adopting legislation?
I think that absolutely, that this thing should be legislated. I do understand, though, that it is difficult to determine in supply chains everywhere. You know what I mean? Supply chains are quite complicated and vast and across multiple countries, so it can be difficult even for companies to find that out. Sometimes they don't necessarily know if there are human rights violations in their supply chain. So legislate, absolutely, but there may be some role for government in facilitating, right, the evidence gathering that would help companies then to abide by that legislation. I think it's absolutely reasonable. Yeah.
Considérez-vous que le Canada...
Do you think that Canada is being lax with regards to forced labor? Do you think that Canada is not making all the necessary efforts to prevent those goods from entering Canada without the necessary verifications compared to the United States, where we see that there's a substantial difference? Why does Canada tolerate that situation?
I think absolutely it's clear that we need to be doing more to do this, not just in China too, in many other countries. And here, I mean, we have versions of forced labor in Canada too, right? I mean, there's been UN studies done, and whether it's in the agricultural sector or elsewhere, there are problems here that we need to address as well. But yeah, absolutely, in respect of imports, our biggest trading partner expects us to be doing more, and we certainly could be doing more.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Chambers, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Larkin, welcome back to committee. Thank you for being here. I'd like to thank our other witnesses as well for joining us. So I'll start with Mr. Larkin for a couple questions. How hard is it to enter a new market? You know, so government signs a free trade deal. You know, how hard is it to start selling our goods there?
Hard.
Very hard.
And let me tell you a bit more about that. Canada's very good at signing free trade agreements. We're one of the top countries in the world with free trade agreements around the world. We've trade agreements in almost every continent. Where we're challenged, though, is our trade implementation. And the trade agreement we have with the EU is probably the largest example. Every trade agreement we have probably has an example, but the way we implement trade agreements, we are severely lacking. One of the things that we're pushing for is for extra powers and extra resources to the Market Access Secretariat. Their role within global affairs is to implement trade agreements. Yet they're underfunded and they just simply require more resources. So what we need to get better at is market implementation. The European Union Free Trade Agreement is the best example of where almost half of the member states of the European Union still haven't ratified the CETA. So we've signed the Great Free Trade Agreement, but it's not necessarily implemented.
Right. So you would say that's only part of the puzzle, right? So signing the deal is one thing. The implementation is another. So would you say we should be careful about signing the deal and thinking the job is done? Like that's a risk, would it not be?
Yeah, I think the first step, obviously, is getting the deal signed. The Canada-Indonesia agreement is a good first step, but now we have to go the extra mile, which is actually implementing that agreement so it benefits not only our grain sector, but our national economy at large.
Right. And some of our challenges we have with China at the moment, we also had these challenges a couple of years ago as well when there was some missteps with the relationship. Do you have any estimates about kind of what that's cost the sector or even your members, either your members or the sector generally so far?
Yeah, so back in 2019, two of our major grain handling companies, they had their licenses revoked from the Chinese government and the Chinese market due to the Huawei Michaels situation, and that cost the sector about $1.5 to $2.4 billion.
Right, and that really as a result of kind of a diplomatic challenge in the relationship, ultimately cost farmers sales and jobs, and yet we're in another situation where now canola is being hit. I think we had some testimony at an agriculture committee recently saying as well that we're into the billions of dollars now with canola. Is that your understanding as well?
Exactly, yeah. I know the Canola Growers Association was at that agriculture committee and referenced a number of $1.6 billion of losses for farmers due to the current tariff situation from China.
Okay. Final question for you. You mentioned the Port of Vancouver. I understood that some of the efficiency stats or the metrics at the Port of Vancouver they're difficult. They don't have the greatest kind of outcomes when it comes to shipping. So it's puzzling to me why they might not have been on a list to receive infrastructure dollars. Do you think infrastructure investment at the Port of Vancouver would help improve those statistics and metrics?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the choke points at the Port of Vancouver are numerous. The second nearest rail bridge is one, top of the list, but I could give you a list of 15 to 20 different projects that need to be invested in at the Port of Vancouver today.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to ask, is it Miss G? I don't want to get your name correct. Thank you very much for your attendance. You mentioned and I'm new to this committee, so I'm just going to ask, you mentioned the net zero shipping, agreement. My question for you is how much is that going to cost your members to implement?
Well, we're already struggling to find alternate fuels that can support the needs of the global shipping industry. So, many of the new builds are built with the dual fuel capacity right now. So it's just a matter of finding fuels. And we're fortunate in Vancouver here. We do have the capability to bunker vessels with LNG. But certainly there are a number of new builds currently on hold, just waiting to see what sort of fuel is available. So there have been targets set for GHG intensity levels, and should they exceed those intensity levels, we're looking at about $100 to $380 per ton.
Very much. I apologize. I think we're a couple seconds over. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Larkin, for all the challenges that you brought up about trade, and then there are many. I have to say that the grain growers of Canada could be really the poster child for diversification. 160 countries around the world that you've been doing this for decades. So you understand very well how to do it. And I'm sure that many of our sectors could take many lessons from the grain growers and how they're able to really diversify their market. But I want to get to the CUSMA. We went through the renegotiation of NAFTA and the modernization of NAFTA that brought us the CUSMA over the last 5 years. What has that meant to the grain growers in terms of your exports to the United States and to Mexico?
Yeah, great question. When I look at the list of trade agreements that Canada enjoys currently, CUSMA is by far the most important trade agreement to the grain sector here in Canada. $17 billion worth to the U.S. is irreplaceable, just like $9 billion worth to China is irreplaceable. Market diversification is extremely important. But at the end of the day, the U.S. and China, the amount that we export to those two countries and the amount that they demand is irreplaceable. We cannot find a replacement market for either of those. So CUSMA has aided our exports both to the U.S. and Mexico. Mexico is our fourth largest trading partner for grain and grain products. There's a great opportunity there to export more, but the U.S. is always going to be our largest customer. They have the dollars for it, they have the population for it, and they simply put, they have the demand for it.
Okay, so from these learnings over the next 5 years, like what recommendations would you have to our committee in terms of this CUSMA review, and what would you see as improvements to the CUSMA as we get into this review?
Well, first thing I want to say is that the good thing is that CUSMA has been operating well for Canada's grain sector. So first and foremost, we need to defend what we already have. Second of all, though, there are ways to improve it. First of all, the trade dispute mechanism needs to be upheld. It is extremely important. We understand our American friends might not like it the most, but we need that as the smaller partner within this agreement. Second is sanitary, phytosanitary regulations and standards. We need to get our regulatory frameworks aligned with the U.S., and we need to ensure that if the Pest Management Regulatory Agency here in Canada or the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, two major agencies that create a lot of of the regulatory systems that govern grain products here in Canada. We need to ensure that first of all they're aligned with the U.S., but second of all that they don't go down a path that unaligns us with the U.S., which we've seen in some recent years.
So I understand those regulations and looking at harmonization. How about with the transportation logistics within the continent? How are they working?
Thankfully, they're working well. I mean, we have numerous rail connections between Canada and the U.S. The main mode of transportation for grain and grain products between our two countries is by rail. And now we have a railway company, CPKC, that obviously connects Canada directly to Mexico. So the rail connections between our three countries is extremely important and has been operating fairly well over the past few years.
Okay, well, thank you. Now I'm going to go to Ms. G. And so, Ms. Xi, from a shipping industry perspective, what's the single most important priority for Canada in this CUSMA review?
In the CUSMA review, all I can speak about is the impact of as we increase volumes through some of our more constrained larger ports on the West Coast. We don't have, I think, the digital infrastructure that we need to optimize the movement of commodities across our supply chain. What happens often in the end is we have vessels that are waiting for cargo that has not yet arrived. And then we find these vessels don't have sufficient number of anchorages, so they're left drifting offshore, waiting until they have the ability to come in and sit at an anchorage and wait for their cargo. So for me, when we talk about infrastructure, I would like to see additional anchorages or more capability to optimize the information and the fluidity of the cargo to the West Coast in particular.
And
Thank you very much. Madame Di Belfay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My question would be for Mr. True. You know that right now it is only the implementation of those treaties that of these agreements that we are looking at, but not the agreement itself. Do you think that those free trade agreement should first be debated and adopted in Parliament before they are discussed in Parliamentary Committee? It's a good question.
There should be a greater role for members of this committee and members of Parliament in the drafting process and perhaps maybe a closer role throughout the negotiations. I know that's been the case to some extent in the NAFTA renegotiations. I believe there was a role, for example, for provincial governments and for Parliament to some extent, but it doesn't make sense to me why Parliament has a yes/no vote on these agreements that are negotiated that deal with so many areas of public policy, well beyond trade. There should be some role in advance to make sure that it has parliamentary approval. Yeah.
Parfait. Alors, on a déposé...
Perfect. So the Bloc Québécois presented a bill. We share your opinion. We think it should be debated. It should be transparent. All those agreements that are negotiated for free trade. Very soon we are going to start the review of this agreement. And you said that we needed to protect workers. And you talked about a rapid response mechanism with Mexico. Can you talk about this a little more within the frame of this agreement? Thank you.
For our organization, it's a priority for Mexican labor unions and for United States labor unions as well. The rapid response labor mechanism in the Canada-US-Mexico agreement has seen a number of successes. It's been used at least 40 times, as I understand it. It has resulted through investigations of facilities directly brought on by workers in those facilities with help from the United States and Canada. It has resulted in employees being reinstated, votes redone for certification of unions, for example, because we know that there are a lot of corrupt unions in Mexico that will try and undermine the rights they have to free collective agreement and bargaining and freedom of speech. And so it has been a success, and groups in Mexico are hoping that it is extended, right, in the review. We understand from the United States Trade Representative that they are, not directly from them, but hearing people that they're talking to, that they are also interested in keeping this process as part of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, and in fact probably making it perhaps better, right, in terms of faster and more accountable. We're worried that the talks are going to split into three, U.S.-Canada, U.S.-Mexico, at which point we lose some control over that, in terms of the Canadian government and the Mexican government working together to improve that mechanism. So we would like to see Canada insisting on that, starting the conversation now with the Mexican government, and hopefully we can keep it as a three-way, right, to increase Canada's leverage in those talks. But very much there's agreement in the United States that this is something we could keep, and I would like to see Canada adopting it as its own policy and putting it into agreements like we have with Indonesia, but they didn't. We don't have a rapid response mechanism in Indonesia where forced labor, child labor is rampant, as we know, in supply chains.
Thank you very much. Ms. Gladue, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Gladue. Vous avez 5 minutes. Merci et merci aux témoins d'être ici. Ma question a été par la perspective d'essayer
And I'm going to start with Mr. Larkin. The government has already done so much to punish the grain industry in terms of fertilizer tariffs, fertilizer limitations, the clean fuel standard, et cetera, et cetera. And now we have things outside of our control like the Chinese tariffs. What do you see as being the biggest barriers to increase Canada's exports and continue to diversify them?
There's many barriers, but thank you for the question. I mean, we spoke earlier about trade enabling infrastructure. I think that's one of the largest barriers that we face, these major choke points, not only at the Port of Vancouver, but all across our rail lines as well. Over 90% of the grain grown in the prairies is moved and exported by rail. So we have to ensure that our rail systems are aligned and working well. And then we have to make sure that our ports, including the Port of Vancouver, but also ports here out east, are operating at their full capacity. And we have competitors around the world that are investing billions of dollars in their individual ports. I'll reference one port. I won't name the country, I won't name the port, but there is a port somewhere in the Indo-Pacific that is owned by a private company, by one individual. That port is more sophisticated, more innovative than all of our ports here in Canada combined, and that port is owned by one individual. So that just showcases how far behind we are in our trade enabling infrastructure and how we have to invest in it today and well into the future.
Thank you for that. I do see that we have pinch points in our ports across the country, both in Vancouver and at the Port of Montreal. And Ms. G, I wonder if you could speak to what do we need to do from ports, not just the large ones that exist, but maybe potential other ports across Canada to increase our ability to export internationally?
Well, I can speak to the Canada Marine Act and the way that ports are governed. Currently, ports can't compete or can't collaborate or work together. So we find that they compete and they don't necessarily optimize how they can share resources or share land capacity that they might have. So we feel that there needs to be a review of the Ports Canada Marine Act, modernizing the ports. There was an initiative underway several years ago. We haven't actually finalized that process. So.
That's true. Certainly the Port of Sarnia, and there's Thunder Bay. There's a number of ports in Bay of Quinte that have access to the St. Lawrence Seaway. That would be really a good idea to expand and increase their capacity in order to expand our exports. Another question for Mr. Larkin. This has to do with the trade agreements we have and the harmonizing of specifications. It appears to me with agreements like the CIIT agreement, our agreement with the UK, some of the other ones, that we are willing to accept their products, even though they don't meet Canadian specifications, but they are unwilling to accept our products. Can you give us some examples of where you think we should be prioritizing the work to harmonize those specifications?
Yeah, great question. I'll give you a concrete example. So one of the largest consumers of durum wheat in the world is Italy, because they consume a lot of pasta, which is manufactured by durum wheat. The challenge there is that they don't want to use Canadian durum wheat, which is top grade, highest quality in the world. They'd rather use their own durum wheat, even when they run out of their own durum wheat. So there's a major issue there of them putting up non-tariff barriers that disallow Canadian durum wheat from entering the Italian market, and that impacts, farm revenues at the end of the day. So that's one concrete example of where non-tariff barriers impact farmers. There's numerous examples of that, not just in Europe, but really around the world, of non-tariff barriers impacting the trade that we could potentially do with these markets.
Agreed. One other thing that was on my mind has to do with CUSMA and the trade that we're doing there, and wondering if there are any issues in that agreement that are on this harmonization of specifications, where we're taking materials from the U.S. in the agricultural food industry, but they're not reciprocal.
I'll give you a concrete example, not from the U.S., but from our other CUSMA trading partner, Mexico, where we want to export more cereals to Mexico, so wheat and barley, but they have certain phytosanitary standards that are not cooperating with what the U.S. and Canada does. Therefore, they're requiring all those exports to be fumigated, which makes exports to their market extremely inefficient. And so that really impacts the amount that we can export to Mexico on a monthly or on an annual basis. So that's one small example of where there's non-regulatory alignment between two trading partners within CUSMA. With the U.S., we're fairly aligned only because of how integrated the supply chains are between Canada and the U.S., but at the end of the day, regulatory cooperation can always be enforced and always be strived for.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Lavoie for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Chair, Madam Chair. Mr. Larkin, you talked about the Vancouver port, a little bit the Montreal port, but mostly the Vancouver port. My writing is in Quebec, so there is a lot of transfer when we talk about grain, and you talked a lot about cereals and grain. In so the region of Quebec is right at the entry of the river, the St. Lawrence. Um, could this port play an added role toward the diversification of our trade with Europe? Another witness last week said there's only 5% per boat that goes toward the States. So we're talking about diversification toward Europe. So Quebec and Eastern Canada, can they play more of a role in the diversification of market, for example, Europe?
I saw the grain terminal and the infrastructure there firsthand. I was happy to see the Parrish and Heimbecker just recently purchased the grain terminal there and has big plans to grow that grain terminal because of the demand they see in markets out east. And it's not just Europe, it's Northern Africa, and it's also going down south to South America. So there's some great opportunities for growth. I'd give a great example of Morocco, who are one of the largest consumers and manufacturers of couscous in the world. How do you manufacture couscous? You need again durum wheat. So Canada is one of the largest manufacturers, suppliers of durum wheat around the world. We can certainly produce more, we can export more, but again, our infrastructure needs that attention, not just in Vancouver. Port of Quebec City is another great example.
Okay, merci beaucoup. La prochaine
Thank you very much. My next question is for Ms. G. Let's continue with everything that is, maritime. I just mentioned it. With Paris-Molot, the Port of Quebec is an active player in Canada. If we talk about the supply chain, we think about what's happening in the U.S., but also what we're thinking about in Canada and diversification. You talked about foreseeability. So in the logistic chain in Canada, what are the investments that are required for a future vision that we should start thinking about? What type of investment? Do you have some concrete example maybe that you could share? Because it's always interesting.
I know everyone often talks about infrastructure, but from my perspective, I always think about maritime domain awareness, and I was very pleased to see the Coast Guard being moved from Fisheries and Oceans under the Department of National Defense. Certainly on the West Coast, we deal with a number of Indigenous groups, and they all have an interest in the waterways in which we operate. So in terms of what we need, I think we need good baseline data. Certainly when we talk about new major projects, we'll be faced with baselines and cumulative effects, which we'll have to manage for any increased traffic. So I think we do need more data on the shipping side of things. There's a significant amount of ocean science, but we all need to make sure that we all agree what all the baselines are. So more digital infrastructure as well.
Alors, juste pour bien comprendre, vous parlez de plus de...
Just to understand clearly, you're talking about digital investment more than physical infrastructure when it comes to the logistics of maritime commerce trade in Canada. Is that correct?
That's correct. And certainly when we deal with the federal government, we're dealing with multiple departments that don't cooperate. There's a lot of repetition and redundancy in reporting to federal governments. We're not maximizing the efficiency and the opportunities within the government to have a single window where we can best manage vessel arrivals and clearances.
Okay.
Okay. Et rapidement,
and quickly, if I have a little bit more time, Mr. True, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. You talked in your introduction of compromises in negotiation. What type of compromise seems reasonable to arrive to proper agreement for Canada, whether it's for the negotiation of the next agreements? What kind of compromises are reasonable for Canada? Thank you very much for the question.
To be thinking about. The World Trade Organization is there. The disputes, as we know, are not going anywhere. They go to the end of the dispute process, then they get appealed into the void. Previous witnesses, I think, before this committee have said the old rules order is in a lot of trouble. The United States has pretty much put the final nail in that coffin. And the compromise is we have to accept that, for example, I understand that there are issues around durum access, for example, in Italy, but you know, for the Italians, it is a reasonable policy that they want to use Italian durum wheat first. You know, we talked about breakfast cereals here, right? It is a reasonable policy. It's maybe not ideal, right, or optimal, for, as they say in market terms, but these are political realities that we have to deal with. People have democratic political realities. They want to develop their own industry. They can't be having someone from, say, the Trade Department or the Trade Law Department of your government saying constantly, well, we can't do that because it says you can't do that here in this agreement that nobody's really enforcing anymore because the rules are in flux. And I think that, you know, if we're going to survive this period, we have to obviously work with like-minded governments. You know, there's a rise of authoritarianism around the world. We can't be working toward that direction, but we can work with like-minded governments on compromise around trade policy. Not so rigid, negotiated outcomes, maybe more so than rigid dispute settlement that results in the rules being followed to the T, and everyone trying to benefit as much as they can and work through how they're going to, you know, produce jobs here and, you know, basically govern in the way they see fit, right?
Thank you very much, Mr. Drew. Thank you to all our witnesses. I will suspend for a minute or two so that we can change panels and get reconnected. So thank you all very, very much for your valuable information. we have David Collins, Professor International Economic Law by video conference. And from the Canadian Cattle Association, Tyler Fulton, President, and Dennis Laycraft, Executive Vice President. And from the Canadian Steel Producers Association, Francois Desmarais, Vice President, Trade and Industry Affairs. Thank you all very much for finding time to come and speak to the committee today. It's a very important time, and we appreciate your commitment to coming to the committee. Mr. Collins, I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please. Mr. Collins is on video conference.
Great, thank you very much. My name is David Collins. I'm a professor of international economic law at City St. George's University of London. I'm from Canada and I have been in the UK about 20 years. And my main perspective is on world trade and investment law, which are my areas of specialty, tends to be from the UK, but I've always kept an eye on Canada and on global affairs generally in terms of trade and investment. And I'd like to start by saying I often find myself being asked about the economic impacts of trade wars, trade barriers, tariffs, and so on. And I think I feel confident that I can comment on that, but I'm a lawyer. And for me, I'm more interested in the international legal implications and the question as to whether or not what we're witnessing in terms of the onslaught of protectionism, tariffs in particular, is legal under international law. And the short answer is that it is not. Much of what we have seen, specifically coming out of the US, but not only the US, we've seen this from China, from the EU and India and other places, probably violates the bedrock of the world trading system that was formulated in the 1940s under GATT, later becoming the World Trade Organization, and spreading into all these regional trade agreements, most notably from Canada's perspective, the USMCA or CUSMA, and also these mega regionals like the CPTPP and so on. So we're obviously in a very fraught time in world trade. Tariffs globally have never been this high. They're the highest they've been since the end of the Second World War. And we're seeing a lot of moves towards protectionism, again, from the US in the forms of tariffs, but also things like export controls and these really sticky non-tariff barriers, such as non-recognition of quality assessment procedures and so on, which I think the EU is particularly known for. One of the problems, the side problems with the US tariffs is it's caused a glut of a number of commodities, such as steel and aluminum and others around the world. And then these have ended up being, the surplus typically coming from China has been dumped into other countries. And this is causing these countries around the world in tandem to impose trade barriers, most noticeably what the EU has done only in the last 48 hours, announcing all these tariffs. So these are a violation of the principles of the GATT. And the main justification that is cited for these measures, again, we tend to associate this with the U.S., especially in Canada. We look at the U.S. as the largest trading partner, and we see what's coming out of Washington. This tends to be justified under the basis of national security. And under domestic U.S. law, it's Section 232 tariffs. Now, if you translate that into international law, this is Article 21 of the GATT. And this was drafted a long time ago in the 1940s. And the language of the GATT is notoriously self-judging. That means that the member state of the World Trade Organization can designate whether it feels that it is having an essential security threat as a consequence of its free trading commitments under the GATT. And there's a similar provision of the GATS, which is the Services Agreement. And the problem with that provision is, especially in the last 5 or so years, it has really been exploited. And countries around the world, particularly the US, but others, have been using this as a justification to impose trade barriers on all kinds of things. Now, you might make an argument plausibly for steel, for aluminum, and so on, but there's all kinds of commodities now. And in theory, the way that's framed, it leaves it beyond the scrutiny of the international tribunals, specifically the World Trade Organization panels. Now, we do have a case under the WTO that tells us that these decisions can be scrutinized for essential security, but it's a very light touch scrutiny, and panels tend to allow countries to follow through with this. And even if they didn't, there's not much in the way of enforcement provisions under the WTO. Just in the time that I have left, because I have a feeling that I'm probably taking longer than I think I am.
Yeah, but 30
I wanted
seconds.
to talk. Yeah, I want to quickly mention investment, of course, the other big element of the world economic system. There's been a noticeable increase in foreign investment barriers around the world. These tend to appear in domestic legislation. Canada, the Investment Canada Act was one of the forerunners of this. The EU has it, the UK has it, the US has it, and there's a concern that these are being used also extensively. And the investment treaties have the same essential security provisions generally, which are, again, self-judging. So countries are using national security to effectively engage in protectionism. And this is creating a cascade effect around the world. And it's causing a lowering of living standards everywhere, including in Canada, perhaps especially in Canada, because of its reliance on the U.S. so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Collins. On to Mr. Fulton, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. On behalf of the Canadian Cattle Association, thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee on this critical need for rules-based trade. As mentioned, I'm president of the Canadian Cattle Association, and I have a beef operation in just outside of Birtle, Manitoba. Through our 9 provincial members, CCA represents more than 60,000 beef producers across the country. As many of you already know, trade is a key part of our business. Approximately 50% of what we produce is exported to markets around the world because of progressive trade deals with countries that also value rules-based trade. We're able to add about 40% of value to each animal. The Canadian Cattle Association has always stood up for free and fair trade, working with the Government of Canada and other stakeholders, including the WTO, which is the international body to promote rules-based trade. Over 98% of the global trade falls under WTO rules or between WTO partners, and CCA has always supported the work our government does to ensure a strong WTO. Rules-based trade has provided the stability necessary for business to trade around the world. Today's context looks different than it did 20 years ago, but the role of the WTO remains. We need Canada and like-minded countries to continue to defend international rules-based trade. And it starts by standing up for Canadian businesses that have been discriminated against as what our sector is currently faced in China. Since 2021, Canadian beef has been shut out of China due to unjustified trade action. We've mentioned at a previous committee appearance that we support the government starting discussions at the WTO to remedy our long-standing market access challenges. It's critical for Canada, an export-driven economy, to defend Canadian interests and stand up to countries who are not following the rules-based trade. Working with allies who share the same standards for science and rules-based trade is key for us to diversify trade. USA is our largest export market by far, and we look forward to the opportunity to appear before your committee to speak more specifically on CUSMA. In the context of today's study, it's pertinent to share this. Earlier this year, the U.S. administration put out a report on non-tariff barriers impacting their exporters. The barriers impacting the U.S. beef producers with third countries are the same barriers that Canadian producers face. We will be stronger economically if we work with the USA to address these barriers and ensure trading partners are upholding science-based trade as the foundation to trade. It is in this context that I flag a significant concern to the committee regarding potential trade with Mercosur. The government announced earlier this fall that Canada would be advancing the resumption of the Canada-Mercosur Free Trade Agreement negotiations. Canadian beef producers are on high alert regarding any potential agreement that would allow further access from 4 of the top 8 global beef exporting countries into our Canadian market. We cannot support any deal that includes beef access to Mercosur. Not only would it displace Canadian beef in our domestic market, but it would bring new challenges for us with our number one trading partner, who has been very clear about how they feel about with trade with Mercosur. We ask parliamentarians to stand up for Canadian beef and our trade opportunities and focus trade diversification discussions with countries who hold the same international rules that Canada follows. There is a lot of global demand for beef, and when we travel internationally, particularly in Asia, we hear of the demand specifically for high-quality, grain-finished beef, exactly what we have to offer here in Canada. It's because Canada follows science-based trading rules that our Canadian beef is sought after as a reliable, high-quality ingredient. I'll end my comments on this note. As an industry, Canadian beef producers are excited about the potential trade diversification growth. Many opportunities are coming through our progressive trade agreements like CPTPP, where outside of the UK, evidence-based trade is the standard. To achieve Canada's trade diversification goals, we need to work together as government and industry to ensure rules-based trade maintains the standard. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fulton. On to Mr. Desmarais, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, honourable members of the Standing Committee on International Trade, on behalf of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, thank you for inviting me today. It's always a privilege to appear in front of you and to have the opportunity to present the views of our industry on various matters, such as this important one on Canada's engagement in a rule-based international trade and investment system. Over the years, many of you heard us repeating that the situation is dire for the Canadian steel industry, and today is no different. In many regards, it's getting worse. The international steel trade market has dramatically embarked on a unique path for the past 20 years, marked by unfair practices, dumping, circumvention, and protectionism. These heavy trends have been accelerating in recent months. Since this past March, we've been facing crippling tariffs imposed by the U.S. administration on our steel crossing the border into our largest market, and these tariffs were later raised to 50% this past June. We are also seeing our Canadian manufacturers and customers being impacted if they dare to use Canadian steel to manufacture their goods and sell them in the U.S. because of the extension of the tariff to derivative products. This has practically shut down our access to the U.S. market. To put things in perspective, last year, we exported 6 million metric tons of our primary forms of steel to the U.S., which is worth about 10 billion Canadian dollars. Every single month that passes by, we export less and less. We're at 50% the monthly volume we used to, and it's diminishing rapidly. Make no mistake, U.S. actions under Section 232 and for steel and steel derivatives are not driven by the behavior of our Canadian producers. It is driven by the global industrial overcapacity in the steel sector, mainly coming from China, who doesn't play by the rules. The Americans have taken unilateral action because no international trade organization has been effectively equipped to address overcapacity, especially in the steel sector. We are facing unfair trade practices in Canada too. Canada's steel industry is the canary in the coal mine. Our industry is the single most important user of the trade remedy system in the country. Of the 55 trade measures enforced by Canada Border Services Agency, 39 cases pertain to steel product or product containing steel. That's 70% of all anti-dumping and countervailing duties. Clearly, we have a problem, and China represents 60% of all steel trade cases. Let me repeat this in French. L'industrie sidérurgique canadienne est le canari dans la mine.
Canada's steel industry is the canary in the coal mine. Our industry is the largest, single most important user of the trade remedies in the country. Of the 55 trade measures enforced by Canada Border Services Agency, 39 cases pertain to steel products or products containing steel. That's 70% of all anti-dumping and countervailing duties. Clearly, we have a problem, and China represents 60% of steel trade cases.
The U.S. have been using their Section 232s and 301 to protect their domestic industry for years, and not just for the steel industry. And as for the European, they announced this past Tuesday that they will impose a tariff rate quota on all imports of steel. including under free trade partners and replacing the safeguards they've been using for many years. The EU policy is in many regards similar to what Canada has adopted this summer. One of the significant differences, though, is that they will limit imports from their free trade partners to 47%, the levels of last year, while Canada has the limit at 100%. Furthermore, our toolkit needs improvement too. As an example, our anti-circumvention legislation needs modernization. We need to do better at addressing unfair trade practices coming from non-market economy, as well as adapting Section 53 of the Custom Tariff Act to put in check new egregious trade maneuver. Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you again for hosting the CSPA today, and I'm looking forward to answer your question.
Thank you. Thank all of you very much. I will now open the floor for questions from our members. Mr. Chambers, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome to all of our wonderful witnesses and those joining us online as well. Mr. Fulton, I just have a couple questions for you. You mentioned non-tariff barriers, and my understanding is UK beef exports to Canada have recently surged quite high. I think well over 170% or something. Is that, as I understand, is that correct?
I'm not certain of the percentages, but yes, absolutely. Over the course of the last 3 years, that's the trend.
Right. And how have beef exports from Canada been to the UK?
They are unchanged at 0.
Right. So we have obviously an issue with, we have a trade agreement, supposed to abide by the rules, but there's also these non-tariff barriers, as we discussed, that also prevents Canadian producers from accessing that market, yet we've allowed access from, reciprocal access is not actually occurring, right? That's in fact happening today.
That's exactly right, yes.
And is that your risk, the risk that you're highlighting, or the concern that you have with agreements with Mercosur or others, that, hey, you could sign a trade agreement, but we could be in the same situation where we have stuff coming in, but we can't have our stuff going out?
No, I wouldn't say that that's... I think that's a valid concern, 100%. But the focus really of our concern really is the possibility of Canada becoming a bit of a dumping ground for South American product that may be a backdoor access into the U.S. And I want to be extremely clear about this. Our American counterparts have made it explicitly clear that they are watching with a very, very watchful eye for that origin product coming in through back channels into the United States. And that poses a very significant risk to the trade that we currently benefit from with the U.S. We can't put that at risk. Further to that, there's another issue that quite simply is it's of a comparable level, and that is we don't have confidence in the things like the disease surveillance systems that are in place in South America. They have a track record of having dubious reporting and surveillance mechanisms that quite simply do not meet the standard that we've become accustomed to.
Thank you very much. So just so I understand, beef could come in from another country, not just displace Canadian beef here, but also find its way into the U.S., which would challenge our relationship with the Americans, of which is our largest trading partner for your producers.
Yep, that's exactly right. Currently, the U.S. represents $6 billion of $7 billion in exports of beef. Of course, there's over and above that, there's the trade, the live cattle trade. But that's what is at risk if we start seeing a significant flow of beef flowing into Canada, notwithstanding the disease-related risk that quite simply is not measurable.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your testimony and highlighting those risks for us as we, consider other potential agreements and discussions that the government might have. Mr. Collins, I have under a minute left, but would you consider, do you have an opinion on whether the 232 tariffs are in fact legal, or would you have a view that, it's Congress's legal right to impose something that looks like a sales tax? Is that something you would have an opinion on?
Well, I have to say, look, I'm not an expert in U.S. law, although I am admitted to the New York bar. My expertise, to the extent that I have it, is international law. However, from what I've read, my sense is that they're probably not legal under U.S. law. And it looks indeed that the courts in the U.S. are probably going to rule that they are indeed illegal. These are powers that fall into the hands of Congress, not the president. So that's my sense, but I wouldn't claim to be an expert in U.S. law.
Well, I'll take that as great advice. Thank you very much for your testimony. Thanks, Madam Chair.
You have 53 seconds.
Oh, perfect. Look at extra time. How did you know? Okay, so Mr. Collins, let's just stay with you. You mentioned about more of the international scene and the changing or impacts of investment. What would you say are the risks to Canada from what you're seeing today in terms of the changing dynamic in the world?
Well, the main risks, I would say, from the perspective of Canada, is for Canadian investors going abroad and seeking to invest in foreign markets, particularly, let's say, the EU, which seems to be taking quite a stringent approach to these national security issues. Now, that's going to differ by member state, and this is very much a member state power. So my concern would be for Canadian companies seeking to invest overseas in countries that are being really strict about their investment standards. To take another example, China. China has a new foreign investment statute. Now, over the years, China has somewhat liberalized its foreign investment regime. Their restricted list has gotten smaller and smaller, but it's still quite significant. And they could easily impose joint venture obligations, or worse, technology transfer obligations, and they could end up stealing intellectual property. Now, going the other way, of course, the other risk is companies coming into Canada might find that the Investment Canada Act is too strict, and it's actually barring companies that want to maintain a presence in Canada and contribute to the Canadian economy and increase competition, perhaps in sectors like telecoms and so on. So from the perspective of, let's say, a Canadian consumer, we would want to have more foreign investment in Canada, more liberalized to increase competition and consumer choice. So it's a fine balance to get this national security right, protect Canada's national security, but also to allow in foreign companies that can increase the competitive environment and make the Canadian markets more dynamic.
Thank you very much, sir.
Mr. Collins. Mr. Nabi, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And let me start by thanking all the three witnesses for your very thoughtful deliberation. I think it's really helpful to us as we're looking into the benefits of rules-based trading system to Canada. And I was listening to all of you quite intently, and correct me if I was wrong, but I heard that you are supportive of a rules-based trading system. You feel that it has helped Canada and Canadian businesses like the cattle sector, like the steel sector, immensely. We are finding ourselves in a very precarious time. Where rules are being changed, where rules are being violated, starting with our biggest trading partner, and of course we are trying to manage that circumstance in a way that is most beneficial to Canadian businesses, to Canadian farmers, etc. So my question is, and I'll ask all three of you, and I've got only a few minutes, so be mindful of each other's time. Give us advice as to what should we as parliamentarians, what should the Canadian government be doing in this moment in order to maintain the Canadian advantage, in order to maintain the rules-based trading system as we navigate through these really challenging time. Perhaps I can start with Mr. Fulton, then Mr. Dermeret, and then Mr. Collins.
Well, in particular for agricultural commodities, I think investments in things like the Indo-Pacific Trade Office that allows a jumping-off point for ag commodities from Canada, I think is a great starting point. That's where we see the opportunities. In the beef sector, we found that many of the Indo-Pacific nations have a strong demand, strong desire for our product, and quite simply, deals like the CIPA deal that was recently signed that will provide access to the Indonesian market, which represents more than 300 million people. That's where we need to be. In the long run, we can be a massive economic driver in the Canadian economy if we continue to hold the standard of the trade agreement similar to the original CPTPP agreement that provided us access to preferred tariff-free access to Japan and Vietnam, for example.
Mr. Demiri?
While I would say that most of our members would definitely appreciate having a rule-based order when it comes to trade, you will have a hard time to find a supporter within our group of the WTO. We have been quite disappointed in the WTO in the last 20 years, especially with welcoming China on board in 2001. And it was done with the promise that China would liberalize its economy, but clearly that has not materialized. So we don't see China as becoming a market economy anytime soon. And a lot of the decisions that have been taken by the WTO throughout the years have been negatively impacting our own protection of our market here. I'm thinking about particular market situation, for instance, or cross-cumulation decisions that have been made. But that being said, what Canada can do, and to us, what seems to be important to protect or at least show the way when it comes to respecting rules and known principle would be to improve our trade remedy system, for instance. Or anti-circumvention legislation needs to be modernized for one. We need to align better our trade remedy system on the U.S. I think the U.S. has a gold standard in terms of trade remedy, and by following their lead and modeling a little bit more the tools that we have, we would send a clear signal that we believe in a fair trading system.
Madame Dibel. Oh, I'm sorry. Were you sharing the time?
No, I still have time, so I was going to ask Mr. Collins if he can answer the same question. Sorry. Thank you.
Very briefly, just to add, I think I have perhaps some interesting insight as an outsider looking at Canada from another country. And I think I can tell you quite optimistically, Canada has an excellent reputation as a champion of world trade. A lot of countries look up to Canada. Canada's doing a great job upholding the world trading system. So I would suggest, my advice would be, Canada needs to continue to engage at these forums like the World Trade Organization, show leadership at the CPTPP, and continue to negotiate free trade agreements as it has been doing. But I think my one piece of advice is what Canada could do better is a number of countries that I've spoken to around the world often suggest that Canada goes too far and tends to include things in trade negotiations that are not really trade related and turns these international trade treaties into sort of general instruments of policy, things like climate change and things like accessibility and inclusivity. And I'm concerned that perhaps there's a little bit of mission creep in some of these trade negotiations when Canada is involved. And I think that makes these agreements much harder. And I would say stick to the core mission, liberalizing trade, lowering barriers to trade and investment, promoting open markets, and be less concerned about these public policy issues that are actually not really trade related.
Thank you. Madame Desparfait, for 6 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Alors,
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Fulton, your comments were very interesting to me. We know that beef producers produce quality beef in Quebec and other provinces, The traceability system is extremely strict, and it takes into account of environmental parameters, the welfare of the animals. And when I hear Mr. Collins say that in our free trade agreements we put in some elements that could be qualified as philosophical element, and I'm kind of wounded because I'm saying we can't be competitive with other countries if we sign agreements with beef producer who ignores all the norms, whether they're environmental or traceability standards. It creates a non-mutual agreement. I mean, we can't be competitive if we take in beef from a place where they don't have any standards. Of course, their beef will be cheaper. So, could you talk to us about the importance of reciprocal agreements in this kind of free trade agreements circumstances?
You very much for your question. I think your assessment is accurate, and that trade can only happen. Reciprocal trade can only happen when there is a common standard. And quite simply, we don't have that confidence. For example, with Mercosur and the countries connected with that trade negotiation. For example, do not have the same labor standard. The labor advantage in, for example, Brazil would be about 3 to 4-fold in cost relative to our per head cost of processing that animal. There's a reason for that. They're not meeting the same standards as what we do here in Canada. You can take also another approach from a sustainability or environmental standpoint, but I think that would be how I would respond. Thanks.
Merci. Je partage votre opinion parce que je pense.
Thank you. I share your opinion because this is the contrary to what Mr. Collins is saying. I think it is very important to maintain our quality standards and to encourage the countries that we deal with to increase their standards. So, a little bit like Europe is doing. There are lots of difficulties entering the European market because their quality standards are much higher. Here's my question. You know that the government really wants to open other markets with other countries. And what we were surprised is the end of the negotiation with the UK in 2024, in a pretty brutal manner. And we don't really understand what's happening. Progress seems to be very slow. Do you have any idea? Have you been consulted by the federal government on the fact that the negotiation with the UK for trade agreement is really slowed and they are actually not favorable to beef producers in Canada?
That you're well informed. It is not favorable for CPT for UK to have been admitted to the CPTPP. It very much lowers the standard of that agreement as it was previous. The non-tariff barriers that prevent access to the UK for our beef producers have been raised time and time again, and there have been no improvements on that. When the agreement was signed, those issues were very obvious and front of mind. It was ineffective for us to sign any agreement with the UK without addressing those barriers.
Merci. Il me reste du temps, madame?
Thank you. Do I have any time? Yes. So, my question for Mr. Desmarais. You talked a lot about the overproduction of Chinese steel. Can you explain very specifically what are the damages that China is doing to our industry and the repercussion or the impact on consumers? Thank you very much for this question. Yes, China is at the source of the problems for the entire steel issue in the world. More than half the production is done in China. So, yes, they consume a lot of steel, but it's low. Like they continue building steel plants and they continue to invest in steel plant capacity in countries right around China. So they continue to produce way more than demand. They're literally flooding the world markets. So all countries, including the European Union, are trying to protect themselves against China. So what we are living right now with the the, the markets that are completely flooded by China, and not just for steel. What we see is also that China is becoming very sophisticated in its industrial approach. So yes, steel is a problem, but also all the products that come from steel. It is not a surprise to see that many of our clients in Canada don't exist anymore. For example, mattresses producers in mattresses. There were steel before, and now China, instead of exporting just steel, they export products that contain steel. So there is a multiplication effect in many, many sectors. And it is a reason why the U.S. Has included in its tariff policies many of the derivated products. So we are there. Yeah.
Mr. Gunn for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Desmarais, in your view, is the average quality of steel produced here in Canada the same, better, or worse than the steel that we import from China?
No question there. I believe that our steel is way better because also we have higher standard when it comes to environmental issues or even labor standards. So even on that regards, definitely better quality.
And I echo that. There's been issues in BC and Victoria. There was a bridge, the Johnson Street Bridge. There's now concerns with the steel used in the Patello Bridge. This all in the backdrop of the current Liberal government pursuing a policy of building Canada, or building Canada strong, as they like to say. Were you disappointed at all to see the deal, a $1 billion deal, to send shipbuilding jobs to China with a below market rate, interest rate loan to create thousands of shipbuildings in China that would use Chinese steel instead of building them here in Canada using Canadian steel?
No, thank you for the question. Very good question. Actually, it shows how difficult it is to address China and its trade policy. I think it would be absolutely impossible for anyone to believe that we can compete on China on many aspects. Just on steel alone, they're highly subsidizing their steel industry. They're also having poor labor standard, environmental standards. So try to compete on them on steel directly is it's impossible. And also for any other type of product or sector where they use steel, because at the base, the commodity that they're using is highly subsidized and impossible to compete with.
Can you maybe go into a bit more detail on how the Chinese steel is subsidized and how same thing happened in shipbuilding where 20 years ago they were at 5% of world capacity, now they're at 50%, and maybe compare the environmental and labor standards employed by Chinese steel companies versus our Canadian steel companies here at home?
Right. I'm not going to necessarily go into the very, very details you're asking me to, but clearly we all know that the average Chinese employee is not earning the same wages that we pay in Canada, for one. We know that on energy, they are also subsidizing a lot of the energy consumed in the steel sector. Still making use a lot of energy, and in China, they're highly subsidizing the energy they're using, for one. And they're also investing massively in R&D at rate or loan parameters that we cannot match as well.
Is the steel that we produce here in Canada, is it of the quality that could have been used in shipbuilding?
We have capacity in shipbuilding in Canada. The specific of the steel that it was used, I cannot definitely assess if we do for the specific, but we do have shipbuilding capacity when it comes to steel in Canada.
Is the steel industry here in Canada subject to the industrial carbon tax?
It is.
Do you have a rough estimate of how much money the steel industry pays in carbon taxes each year?
I do not have those figures. This is commercially sensitive, and each of our members probably keep those numbers close to their chest.
Is it safe to say that the individual companies and the industry at large would be more competitive internationally if it didn't have to pay an industrial carbon tax, and those lower prices could be passed on to Canadian consumers?
Very good question. Actually, part of your question refers to competing and opening new market, and that for us, whether we have a carbon tax in Canada or not, we don't see this as a possibility for us because there's way too much steel in the world. So we simply cannot compete on the international level on that front.
And that it goes back to the subsidization and the dumping of Chinese steel around the world, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And one other question for you. The tariffs that are currently being put on Canadian steel that go in the U.S., are the same level of tariffs being placed on American steel that would be entering Canada today?
No. We have a different regime in place, different countermeasure being put in place, different level. And my understanding is that there's some evaluation being done right now on countermeasure being applied on U.S. steel, being contemplated by the Canadian government.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Lavoie, please, for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci, Madame la Présidente. La première question est pour Monsieur Collins.
My first question is for Mr. Collins. You mentioned a lot of protectionism and tariffs. There are things happening that are quite remarkable right now with what's going on in the United States. Everyone is trying to diversify everywhere around the world. We're all looking for the same thing. Last week or 2 weeks ago, we welcomed someone, Mr. Herman, who said after 45 years of career, it was something he'd never seen anything like it. That was his job, to negotiate agreements, trade agreements. So we're now entering an era of so unprecedented, really. Is it a new era of trade? The rules that we saw have changed or will change. If you agree with that, in your opinion, what should the situation look like 10 years down the road in order to arrive at a situation where Canada could, with all our industries, really find the rightful place with diversification or new rules? I'd like to know what's your vision of what the world market should look like in this new era 10 years down the road.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a great question. I would like to give you an optimistic answer and say that everything will be fine in 10 years and we'll be back to a happy multilateral community under the aegis of the World Trade Organization, but I think that's unlikely. I think we're entering an era of new normal, and the heyday of free trade of the early part of the 21st century, latter part of the 20th century is probably over or nearing, it's certainly declined. So I suspect what we will see emerging towards in the next 5 to 10 years is probably a cleavage of the world realistically into two halves. And this has been studied. There's a good deal of international relations scholarship on this, as well as international legal scholarship. It will be a U.S. world and a China world, and it will be the U.S. world with its allies and the Chinese world with its allies. And I think we know where Canada is. It's going to be in the American camp. And this is why maintaining a strong relationship with the U.S. is so important. So there'll be a Western camp, the U.S., the EU, UK, and portions of Asia, Australia, and Japan, and so on. And then the rest of the world, China and Russia, and India, we don't know. India is sort of straddling the line. We'll see where India ends up. One of the concerns that I have with that paradigm that I just suggested to you is that it looks like most of the developing world, that is Africa, South America, South Asia, is probably going to be in the Chinese camp, and that's due to the enormous success of the Belt and Road regime, which has been taking place under our noses over the last 5 years, as well as the retreat of the U.S. in the last couple of years from the world stage, which has enabled China to muscle its way in. So again, we know where Canada is going to be in that paradigm. I don't think that's much of a question, but it will be interesting to see what what the rules frameworks are, where will the WTO be? I suspect the CPTPP will be one of the dominant regimes for the US-Canada Pact, and RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes China and a couple of other Asian countries, is probably going to be what the other group looks like. And I would just hope that our one, the Western one, stays true to the principles of free markets, and not just free markets and liberalization, but picking up on something I was alluding to earlier, is to the extent that we do have these standards, we've talked about labor standards and environmental standards. My hope is that it would be science-based. I want a rational, science-based regime, and I think we're seeing that in the language of the CPTPP. I don't want to see this precautionary principle that the EU has been pushing, where it's everything is dangerous until we've checked it out, so let's just ban everything, which really seems to be the mentality of the EU. So science-based and free markets, but I think we know who our allies are, and it's going to be with the US, so we need to straighten out that relationship.
Thank you very much. On to Madame Belfay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Desmarais, you talked to us a lot about the Chinese dumping. Actually, I think we could say that Canada has been applying a surtax on Chinese steel, and you look positively on the position of the European Union on verifying the origin. Do you think that those measures are sufficient, and should additional measures be brought in? A very good question. Of course, for more than a year at least, we have been asking for customs duties to be applied on Chinese steel entering the country. Now, since November last year, measures have been in place, and up to now this year, we see about half of the imports of Chinese steel, significant reduction, which is a very good thing, and it is welcome. And in fact, Canada, we must recognize that the government has taken a good innovative measure, which is ahead of many other countries, by imposing a surtax on steel that is based on the way the steel is produced, with traceability, and we're really targeting Chinese steel, which is a good thing. We're still receiving some Chinese steel, a considerable amount. The European Union has been adopting the Canadian traceability model. The Americans also have a traceability system, but we have to do more, particularly when the time comes to talk about derived products and products that contain steel, because that's where China is going to move ahead in the future. If they see that their primary product cannot enter the market, they'll quite simply use their steel in finished products. So we need to make an effort on labeling to see what the processed product is. If we see that there's some Chinese steel in the second processing. In the past 6 months, we've seen an identification of some 1,000 products of steel and aluminum, which are subject to the surtax in Section 232. We know that some of those products, we're receiving considerable products from China. And for the list of 1,000 products, I think we've received $4 billion worth of those products overall from China last year. So we know that there is Chinese steel entering Canada quite a lot in those products, and we need to find some way to imitate the Americans and target Chinese steel that's contained in products.
McKenzie for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Collins, it was an interesting week. Earlier this week, our Prime Minister went out for lunch. He visited President Trump in the White House. On one hand, it was good that he was in that room. On the other hand, I don't believe we saw any progress on the promises our Prime Minister has made in respect of new negotiations, new deals, new opportunities. I'm wondering if you could comment on your perspective as to what transpired this week, but also what you may be hearing or seeing as the viewpoint being taken in the UK.
Yes, thank you very much. Interesting question. I think the meeting with the Prime Minister and the President looked to go quite well on the surface, and I think Mr. Carney is doing a great job in handling Mr. Trump. They seem to have developed a good relationship, and that's very important with a president that values personal relationships. I'm concerned about the comments that were made by Mr. Ludnick with regards to the Canadian auto sector. That is really troubling, it seems as though perhaps steel and aluminum will be resolved, but it's the automotive industry of Canada that I'm genuinely worried about. It doesn't look like the Americans want to have any assembly being done in Canada, so that's very much a cause for concern. I have to be honest to you. It may come as a surprise to Canadians. The UK is actually not terribly interested in what's going on in North America. It really is not on the radar here. In this country, the concern is the bilateral relationship between the UK and the US. And of course, the most important relationship for the UK is with the EU, especially under the Labour government here and Prime Minister Starmer, who wants to evidently bring the UK back in the ambit of the EU. But I think, generally speaking, every country in the world watches all of the interactions taking place in the White House because they feel like they're next. It's sort of like sitting in the waiting room of the dentist. You hear the sounds coming in the other room and you're nervous because you're going to be the next person in the Oval Office. So I think to the extent that President Trump has been welcoming and has changed his tone and is much more respectful to the new Prime Minister of Canada, I think that's a good sign, and it shows that there's at least some willingness for negotiation. And of course, in this country, there was an agreement signed between the UK and the US, but it wasn't a full free trade agreement. So I suspect that what I think we're going to see is I think obviously the USMCA has a number of years yet before it expires, but I wouldn't be surprised if there'll be some mini deals, perhaps sectoral deals that won't actually technically under the Vienna Convention really be treaties, but this seems to be the new way of doing things, memoranda of understanding, which may be sector specific. So I would like to think we'll see some of those trickle out in the coming months, such as the US has done with Japan and some other countries. So I'm cautiously optimistic about most things, except for the auto sector. That is troubling.
Thank you very much. Very comprehensive answer, Mr. Collins. What things do you see by way of leverage? How do we address our relationship with the U.S. to gain some overall restoration, frankly, of the extensive trading relationship we've had in the past? What leverage do we have?
Well, there's a couple of things. Obviously, the big one is the natural resources and the crude from Alberta. Those are the real big ones. There are some other small ones. The digital services tax, I thought that was a great move to get rid of that. I personally advocated that. I've written papers on that front. It seems like that gun has been fired now, so I don't think that leverage can be used again unless perhaps Canada were to threaten to bring it back. That would be another thing. I don't know that would maybe set the right tone. The other leverage is perhaps softer, the soft relations of Canadian tourists informally boycotting the U.S. That I think that would be that's something that Canada has justifiably threatened to do. We've heard Premier Doug Ford talk about the liquor issues, and he was talking about natural resources again. I'm not sure that's within his ambit. But the natural resources are the big one. But the other thing is, I think it behooves Canadians, as I think that the team is doing, to point out to the Americans that there really isn't an American auto sector and a Canadian auto sector. There's a North American auto sector. The sectors are so deeply integrated that by attempting to uncouple the supply chain from Canada will ultimately be disastrous for the US. So it will be ultimately a self-defeating process. I think it is a nostalgic pipe dream to think that you can bring back the manufacturing heyday of the 1950s and 1960s in the US. And I think some of the intelligent, bright people are probably whispering in President Trump's ear and explaining that to him. But I think that the approach Canada's taken now is pretty good.
We're just trying to make sure.
No problem.
America will be our last.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so I'll just go straight to Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, I know that you've been a proponent here of the WTO, but for the vast majority of witnesses that have come to our committee have been very critical of the WTO. They find that it is ineffective. It is not working in any way, shape, or form for them. And when it comes now to the rising protectionism that we see in the United States, we have an opportunity now through this CUSMA review. And where would you see, how would we approach that opportunity to address the 232 tariffs that really hit us in a way, blindsided ways? And with the 232s, the damage is already done. Once, a sector is hit by the 232s, we see how it affects that business, and sometimes it's not repairable. So if you can just address that and how to approach the CUSMA review and for a dispute resolution system that would work to be able to grow our market here.
Just first on the WTO, look, I completely understand that, and I'm not here to disagree with people and say the WTO hasn't been working. It's got a lot of problems, but better that we have it and it can be reformed than we don't have it at all. The WTO is doing a lot more than people realize. There's a lot of committee work going on that's establishing international standards. There's a lot going on the digital trade front. There's a trade facilitation agreement. There's an investment facilitation agreement. We tend to think of the WTO and these glamorous, the tariffs on autos and so on. We know the dispute settlement system is not functioning as it was meant to do, but there's still the panel procedure. There's the interim multi-party interim appeal arrangement that Canada's part of. So it is partially functioning, not as well as it should. So I don't think we should be dismissive of it as we tend to be. And on the second point about CUSMA, I think your question related specifically to dispute settlement on CUSMA. Look, the dispute settlement system, we have the neutral tribunals, international tribunals, composed of panelists appointed by both sides. Procedurally, I'm not terribly concerned about that. I know we eliminated the investor-state dispute settlement in the redraft of the CUSMA, and I think perhaps that was a mistake, but I'm not convinced that it was a massive mistake. I think the dispute settlement procedures are totally fine. I don't think there are issues there. Maybe some here and there about transparency. What Canada needs to do to deal with the Section 232 is, I think we know what the answer is. What the Americans are always complaining about is the dairy issues. They don't like Canada's supply managed dairy system. No country in the world. I go all over the world, and you're from Canada. What about your dairy? Why is your dairy sector so heavily controlled? And I know that's politically sensitive in Canada, and you maybe don't want to hear this because you all know it, but that is a big issue for Canada's trading partners, and that really needs some resolution.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. J'ai une question pour Monsieur Desmarais.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question for Mr. Desmarais. Everything you said was super interesting, whether it's for beef or what Mr. Collins said. It's really interesting. The policy by Canadian, what effect could this have on our national production of steel? That is a good question. I have to say our industry have been asking for years to have this buy Canadian policy for steel. I'm very happy that this policy is now taking shape. And for what we have seen of this policy, it's really good. The parameters are favorable for our industry, and we do believe that it's going to have a positive impact for our members. But it's one element amongst many, all the measures that are announced in our industry. So we are definitely welcoming this in a favorable manner. Thank you.
Collins, tantôt, vous avez été critique dans les...
Earlier, you criticized the partnership agreement when we talk about inclusivity. And I have to say, as a woman, international trade is much harder when you are part of a minority. So I want to hear your opinion about this.
Yes, I think it's a very important issue, but I think it's an issue that should be dealt under Canadian legislation, domestic Canadian system. I think it's very dangerous to start imposing non-trade values on countries that have a different culture and a different approach. And I think that a lot of countries resent this, and they see Canada leveraging trade agreements and turning them into these sort of broader instruments of governance. If Canada is interested in promoting inclusivity internationally, which it's totally right to do, I think it's a valuable cause. Don't use trade to do it. I think it's the mixing the issues that are problematic. I was in Peru speaking to some Peruvians, and it was in particular the climate change. There was this comment: why are the Canadians always going on about carbon and climate change? And developing countries, they have other priorities, and I think that's undermining Canada's status. I would say that's my take on that. Not that they're not important issues, just maybe not appropriate for that context.
So much to all our witnesses. It was extremely valuable information. Very much appreciated. Happy Thanksgiving to you. Happy Thanksgiving to the members and our witnesses. Sorry, I got my phone on.